this tutorial, I'll walk you through my editing process from animating effects on climbing holds to creating seamless loops. You'll learn how to craft freeze frames and graphics, scan climbing walls, synchronize them with climbing footage, and animate a dynamic flying camera that highlights each hold on the wall. I will show you how I made this video step by step, guiding you through the process and how you conquer Premiere, After Effects and Blender to create these graphics. Hopefully, within no time, you'll be able to make a video of your own that looks just like this. Creating this video was a lot of work, and because I'm a small channel, it would really help me if you could like this video and subscribe to my channel. This way I can continue to make more videos in the future. But now let's take a look at what equipment I actually use. Alright, let's talk about equipment. So what I actually like to get is one of these guys. It's a Gorilla Pod, which is really cool to give you flexibility. You can attach these to holes or to a wall. This is great for outdoor bouldering because you can really adjust it to like the rough terrain that you're filming on. One of my favorite gadgets is this super small handheld thing where you can attach the camera to. But the nice thing about this is that you can turn this into a mini travel tripod, and there's actually this button here where you can even flatten this out, which makes it way more stable. And I love this thing so much. This is really cool for shooting at the gym. It actually also has a hook here at the end where you can then hang this down from something. It just gives you like a lot of versatility and lots of options to film from. And then I actually invested a little bit of money into getting a better camera. I'm actually using the Sony ZV-E10, which is entry-level model for cameras. It's really great. It's probably one of the best additions I've done to my equipment because with a 4K resolution, you can zoom in nicely compared to a 2K resolution, and it makes rotoscoping so much easier. So highly recommend if you want to do more content like this, to just invest into something that just gives you that extra resolution. I really love this camera because it's really small and it doesn't draw that much attention when you film with it, but it only works really well when you have it stable on a tripod. So if you're planning to do a lot of handheld content, I probably wouldn't recommend you buying this. Luckily with my content, I do everything on a tripod. And I mean, I really love this camera for the content that I'm doing. But yeah, that's pretty much it with my equipment. Now the first step is to pick a climb. In my case, I actually chose this purple V7, and I chose it because it was actually very easy to climb. It was more on the V5 range, I feel like. But I always try to pick a climb that has something interesting to it. In this case, it actually had like a nice toe hook sequence that allowed me to get through a whole bunch of moves with one toe hook, and I always try to pick something where I feel like it actually allows me to teach people a little bit about climbing. Now when it comes to setting up your cameras, I think variety is key. In this case, I actually took a frontal shot, a side shot, and a shot from the right that was actually above the climb, giving me a bird's eye view, which is always nice for variety. Now, first camera angle, I started filming, and it's something that happens a lot at a gym where it's busy. People walk into your camera. In this case, this wasn't too bad because I knew I could work around with other angles, but sometimes I would actually go back and reshoot this angle. Camera number 2 from the left. This is actually how my setup looks like. It's very minimal, very low profile. Now my third camera, like I said, I put up at the top of a climb, which is always great to give a little bit of a bird's eye view onto the climb, and that can really break up your edits nicely. Now let's hop into Premiere Pro and work on our first rough cut. It's really just me trying to figure out which angles I need to focus on, how I could work around maybe certain areas where someone walks into the screen, and I'm not really worried about framing cameras and zooming in or any of the effects yet. This is really just for me to figure out the sequence of movement and working a little bit faster than in After Effects, where we'll be going next after this. This is really just for me to rough it out. Now I really like to record it until the very end when I jump off the wall, because it offers for a great opportunity to loop your clips, and we'll go into that later. Now let's move into After Effects where we will be creating all our effects. Now what you can do from Premiere Pro is actually take your edit and create an After Effects composition right away that is now linked to your edit, and you can always refresh and load in Premiere as well. What I like to start with is actually organizing my projects so that I can easily find things. Now we want to grab the first clip and drag it down onto the new composition icon and create a new composition from it. With B and N you can set the beginning and end of your work area, and then with the right click, trim comp to work area to get rid of any excess footage. Now let's start with the rotoscope. We want to select the rotoscope brush in the top of the menu and then double click into your video. This will now open a new window where you can start drawing. The way the roto brush works is that with the control left mouse button you can actually make it bigger and smaller, and then you can start drawing along the areas that you like to keep. So I'm marking everything as green of what I want to keep, and then with Alt left mouse drag you can actually subtract areas that you want to erase. And I actually take my time to make this first frame look as good as possible, because this one will now dictate all the other frames following. There are a few options in the bottom left corner where you can actually look at your result and just try out for yourself what works best for you. Something that's important, that even further in the bottom left of the window, you actually have a transparency attribute where you can actually look at the final result when it's rotoed. Now, once you press play, everything should happen automatically, and this will go actually much slower than what you see right here. I was actually speeding it up. Now, the roto brush is great, but it's not perfect. And oftentimes when you cover and reveal holes behind your body, the brush will actually get confused and you will have to start erasing pieces again. And I think there it's important again to start at the very first frame where the problem occurs, because otherwise you will have to do much more fixing than is necessary and it can become a nightmare. Now you can see shoes in general, because they're black rubber on black wall, are a little bit of a nightmare, and you have to pick your battles where you feel like now's a time where you really need to make them stand out and where there's an effect where you want them to be shown. But now I make my way through the entire video, which can take a long time, but something I noticed in the past is that you want that roto pass to be as solid as possible, because otherwise down the line you will just have to go back and make it look better again. Once you made your way through all the rotos, you can actually now freeze the roto, which will actually temporarily cache this and let you scrub easily back and forth, and it doesn't have to recalculate all the frames, but it still uses a lot of memory. And instead what I like to do is just export the whole clip as a PNG sequence and then re-import it into my edit, so I can just lay it over, and whenever I need to make changes I just re-export it and bring it back in. Once I've done the first roto, I now immediately jump into the second camera and just work my way through that one as well. Like I said, I like to spend my time with this and really make sure it looks good, and just go through all three cameras before I jump into the next step. Now let's set up the effects shots. Once again, I want to make sure that my work area has a good range, so I use B and N to set the in and out points of my work area, then I right click and trim comp to work area. Now I want to have one comp per camera angle, and what I do is actually take the rotoscope that I exported and bring them into that composition and lay them on top of my recording. Now I can simply drag it around and find that matching frame that it perfectly overlaps with the recording underneath. Something that's really useful here is actually to find an area where there's a big change of motion, so it makes it easier to judge whether you're frame off. I do this with all three cameras because each of these compositions will be the foundation for all our effects, where we will put the effects between the rotoscope and the actual recording. Next, I'm actually going to rebuild the edit with those compositions that we just created, and I'm gonna actually reduce the opacity slightly to find each matching frame, and then I'm gonna use Alt, open bracket and close bracket to quickly set the in and out points for this layer. And this way I can now keep working on each individual clip and it'll update as we keep going forward. Next, I actually export a single frame from my video in which I'm not climbing, and I open it up in Photoshop to quickly remove all people from my video and have an empty gem. I use the lasso tool to draw rough selections around each person and then use the generative fill option to quickly remove them and replace them with a new background. This can take a few attempts, but is a very quick way to just get a clean plate that you can now import back into After Effects and put it in between your rotoscope and your actual video. Now I draw a rough selection of the area where I want no one to show up. This will now also allow me to still have the fans at the top spinning, and you can then also use a feather on the mask to make the transition a little softer. I repeat the steps for each clip, and in this camera angle I actually draw a mask and then subtract it in order to reveal the wall behind it. Same thing for the third camera angle, and once this is done we're gonna actually start directing the eye. With nothing selected, I can now draw a shape with a pen tool, which will create a new shape layer that I will actually trace along the wall and create a shape that will allow me to darken the background. Right now, everything in this set is really distracting around it. There are bright lights, and I really want the audience to focus on the climb itself. So what I'm going to do next is actually fill this shape with black, adjust the opacity to semi-transparent, and then keep adding more shapes to the same layer to darken the areas around the wall. Areas like the gym on the right or the ceiling are really bright and distracting, and I'm trying to darken them in order to guide the eye of the viewer towards the wall. In addition to that, I'm also going to draw a shape across the wall that I'm going to feather quite heavily, making the illusion of it being in the shade, and then I'm going to draw another layer at the ground that I'm actually going to subtract from everything and also feather in order to create the illusion of a fake light at the front. Now, if you look at the difference between before and after, you can clearly see how now you're way more guided looking at the climb rather than being distracted by the busy background. Now I'm going to continue on the other two camera angles and do the same process using a shape layer with simple masks and feathering. Now, since I've been working on this for a while, I created an anim library with different animations for holes, and I think it's something that I encourage you to do as you don't do the work over and over again. But now let's look at how you can create an animation by yourself. I create a new comp and drop one of my recordings in there so I can have some reference for a hold. Then I take the pen tool and start tracing one of the holds. You can do this fairly roughly if you want because you can still adjust the curve afterwards, but I like to actually work with the stroke to 0 and no fill on the actual shape. And at this point, if the color looks a bit difficult, you can also change it over here and give it some more of a pink tone. And now I start drawing the shape. Now what I'm doing is I'm using V to click on a knot and then readjust its tangents easily to perfectly match that shape. So you don't have to draw perfect from the beginning. If you hold Control and click onto a knot, it's going to disappear. And then at any point in time, you can click into an open space on the stroke and you can add a new knot. Now, once I'm done with the shape, I give the stroke some thickness again and assign a color, in this case, white. Now I give it a descriptive name by hitting enter, and then we're going to look at how we can animate this path. If you open up the layer, you can actually see the path and the shape of it. But what I'm going to use is go to the add menu and then add a trim path option. What I do a lot is hit U in order to reveal any keyed attributes I have. And if I press U on something that's open, it'll close that layer again and quickly come back to a compact view. So if I hit U twice, it's actually going to show me the keys and some more options. Pressing U is very useful in order to keep your scene managed and access the areas that you want to work with quickly. Now at this point, I actually started keying the attributes of the trim path option. And what I'm doing is actually setting the beginning to 0, 0, and then the next key to 0, 100%. What this does, it actually animates the stroke along the path that I've just created. And now I can just go a little further down the timeline and actually set the next key to 100 and 100%. What this does, it starts animating the stroke in and then starts animating the stroke out. This is a very fast way to animate something. You can also now easily just offset some of the keyframes, and then it'll actually hold the shape a little longer before it disappears. So here I'm exaggerating it, so it really holds it longer and then starts going away. And now what I like to do with this, I also add an offset paths option. And what this does, it actually now offsets the path by a certain pixel value. This looks kind of weird and confusing at first, but once you start changing some options, you will see what we're trying to do very quickly. Now when I work with strokes, I usually like to change the line cap to be round cap and the line join to be round join. This will take away the sharp edges and help us to make the stroke feel more like it's painted. Now on the offset path option, I am actually switching the line join also to round join, and once you do this, you can see a drastic change in how it's now coming together and feels more like this bubble that's expanding from the hold. At this point, the only thing that I kind of want to do now is at the very end, adjust the opacity and have it fade out so it doesn't feel so abrupt. So I set a key at 100% and then the frame at the end is 0%. You can already see it feels like this bubble that just shoots out and then fades away. And we didn't even animate anything by hand. This was all by adjusting some values. And here just go in and tweak a little bit of the curves to make the transition feel a little bit nicer of the amount from the trim offsets path. And if you now take the layer and duplicate it, you can very quickly just offset that one layer and readjust some of the attributes and get a complete different feel for it without having to reanimate the whole thing or create like another one of them. With Alt brackets, once again, I keep my files clean and set the in and out points for a layer. And at this point, what I like to do is go to the stroke and actually play a little bit with the wave attribute, because this will help to give your stroke a little bit more of an organic feel that feels more like a pencil drawn, where not every line is perfect. Sometimes the pressure might have changed, and already just dialing that in, it feels like it's such more interesting shape than it did before. Now with the wave, I am going to go to the top layer as well and going to adjust this as well. Give it slightly different values, and in addition to this, in order to make this shape feel a little bit different, I'm going to increase the stroke size on this one to give it a little bit more emphasis. if you pay close attention, you can actually see these weird artifacts where the path starts and ends. In order to fix this, now I'm going actually onto the stroke, and you can use the taper option now to taper the start length and end length, and that'll smooth out the shape. Once you dial those in a little bit, you can see now that connection disappears. Now we just gotta repeat the process on the top layer. And once this is dialed in, you have like a nice fade at that point, you're pretty much done. You animated a hold, and this is how I've done all my shapes in the videos. It's very straightforward, and the nice thing is that you can reuse it very quickly for future videos. Now, in order to make this look a little bit more pretty, I'm gonna assign a glow to this layer, and what I do is I can now actually change the stroke color of this hold, and this will also change the color of the glow. Rather than doing it on the glow, I like to do it with the actual stroke color. And now I can actually intensify the glow by duplicating it a few times. And then I actually adjust each of those different glows independently. I make one a little bigger to give it like this aura around it, one's a little sharper, and overall this also intensifies the glow. Now what really amps it up is if you duplicate your layer, and on the top layer you actually take all the glows away except for one, and you make that one white. This will really give it this burning, intense feeling. And this is how all my holes are structured. I have one at the bottom that gives it the glow, and the top one is pretty much that white one that gives it this intense feeling. Now I just duplicate the process with the other hold, and at this point I can literally take the bottom layers, copy the effects from that layer onto the other one, and vice versa. I do that with the top layer from both holds as well, and now I've got two glows. In this case I actually adjust a little bit that bottom layer because it feels a little intense. So I'm playing a little bit with the glow here. I'm gonna like dial it down a little bit so that it matches a little bit. And at this point you have your amazing looking hold. That's all it took. So now we're gonna continue and actually create all the paths that we need for our shots. And by doing so, I'll just pretty much replicate the process we have just done. And I'm gonna trace all the holds in my first camera. I find an angle where I'm not obscuring them. And now I trace every single hold that is in that shot. This is also why it's important that your camera is static, because if the camera moves, the shape will have to be adjusted and matched. That's why I like to always film anything on a tripod or on a hard surface, because otherwise you would just be creating more work for yourself that you then have to fix this in After Effects. As the next step, we're gonna go back to the library where we just created our shape, and I'm gonna copy the animation that we just created. I'm gonna paste it into my camera composition. Next, I want to open up the shape layer that holds all the drawings of the holes on the wall, and I'm going to copy the path of the first hold that I want to apply the animation to. And now I'm going to go back to my animation, and I'm going to double tap U to reveal all paths within that layer. And then I want to select all paths attributes, and with all selected, I can now press Ctrl V to paste the path from the hole on the wall into this animation. And what you should see now is that the animation has been applied to the first hole on the wall. Now the last thing I like to do is actually shift the layers to the point where my hand touches the hold first, and that kind of triggers the animation to start. And at this point I'm going to repeat the steps, and I'm going to find the path of the next hold that I want the animation to be copied on. I'm going to bring in a new set of animations, and I'm going to paste the paths onto these layers, which will now adjust the animation to the shape of the hold. And from here on, I repeat the same step for every hold on every shot. In my case, you can see that the shapes don't really end up in the same spot. That's because my animation library has an aspect ratio of a vertical video, and if both compositions match, and if you paste the shape, they should actually match 1-to-1. So this is really just because I decided to change my composition settings. Now this is how a first pass should look like. I did this on the first camera. It's currently playing at twice the speed, but I want to have 3 videos that look exactly like this, where I have a single camera with all animations on the holds. And like I said, I recorded to the very end until I hop off the wall. And now once again, we have to repeat the same step for the remaining cameras. Once this is done, we can actually now make the video look way more interesting by adding some camera animation. What I want to do is select all of my shots in the main edit and set them to 3D, which you can do here by clicking this little button. Then I'm going to create a camera in my scene. With this camera selected, I am now using Ctrl-Shift-D to actually cut them into matching pieces with the clips underneath them. I want to have 1 camera per clip, and what I actually like to do is separate dimensions on the position attribute, because that allows me to individually animate the X, the Y, and the Z axis. without having to key all of them at the same time. So now I'm just going to do the same step for the remaining cameras, as I separate dimensions. And now I'm going to do a first camera pass. By doing so, I actually try to find like my starting frame where the whole camera is in view. When you do this, you probably have to readjust a little bit, and now I just go roughly through the edit and I think about what type of framing I would like to have. I try to keep the subject in the middle of the frame, and as I'm working, I also like to actually go into the splines and make sure they have tangents on them, just so that the camera movement itself is a little bit smoother. And this way I work my way through the edit. It's always good to maybe also go to the end frame first to figure out, okay, what does that end frame look like that I want to go towards, and then you already have like some in-betweens that you can now adjust in the middle. I actually like to sometimes enable title action save guides so that I have some sort of guidance where the center of the frame is. And now I'm just going to go in there, add some frames, add some movement. I want to feel like it's a little bit of a handheld camera, so it's not perfectly, there's some wiggle involved with this, so differences between X and Y positions is key. And now I'm just going to do like one of those first rough passes as I go through the edit. Especially during cut, I stay in the same spot on frame, which makes the transition just feel a little bit nicer than if you were to like suddenly jump from one side of the image to the other side of the image. So I always make sure to track myself where I am from one shot to the other. And this is what my first camera pass looked like. At this point, it is still very rough cameras. I probably overdid it in a lot of areas, but I like to actually render this out just to give me an idea of which areas I need to adjust, because sometimes it's not as easy to cache everything within After Effects, and I like to just look at the whole edit, collect my notes, and then go in there and adjust as I keep working on things. Especially this shot, I feel like it's way too busy, and I'm going to tone this down as I keep working on it. And now we're going to start working on adding graphics to this. And what I like to do is identify a frame that I think would be a good pose for like a freeze frame. Then I'm going to split my layers using Ctrl-Shift-D and then turn this one frame into a freeze frame, where I'm now going to shift everything to the side and extend this frame so the pose is being held for a longer period of time. Then I'm going to take my camera again and I'm going to delete the other cameras and just going to extend this camera across the other two layers as well, because they cover the same shot and I want to just have one camera per shot. Now you can see already as I play through it holds. I'm going to find another pose. I'm going to extend this clip and going to find another pose that I think it would be good to cover. In this case, I have 3 poses. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to split the layer for one frame, and I'm going to take this single frame, freeze frame it, and then I'm going to shift everything to the side and extend the frozen frame. Now on those frozen frames, I'm actually going to now create shape layers in which I trace my silhouette. I'm going to create different shapes per different areas of my body. The legs are one shape, the shoes are a shape, my body is a shape, and the head is a shape. And this will allow me to assign different colors to each one of them and help identify each individual body part, which is key for climbing videos. Once I drew on my shape, I pre-composed all layers together into one composition by pressing Ctrl-Shift-C. And once again, set this layer to 3D to be recognized by the cameras. And then also copy the position from one of my other layers onto the brand new layer to make sure that they also match in space. Now I apply my recipe from previous animations, which is a simple combination of a gradient ramp, a hue and saturation node, and a deep glow. Deep glow is a third-party plugin and can also be replaced by After Effects glow effect. To change the color of my overall silhouette, I actually animated the channel range attribute. All it's doing is just changing the angle over time, so it slowly changes color from one hue into another. Gradient ramp is actually what establishes the color tone and also the fall off I get from the top of the silhouette to the bottom of the silhouette. In order to keep my main edit composition clean, I like to pre-compose all the layers we have just worked on for the single pose, and then I'm once again gonna change the end point for that composition, and then I do the same thing for the end. Inside the random heel hook composition, I now actually make sure that I have the right work area, once again to keep things nice and organized. Next step is to add animations to my graphics, and once again I have an animation library for this step, and they all pretty much follow the same type of recipe in order to create them. I'm gonna demo you on how to create your own shapes based on the example of creating an arrow. So what I'm doing is take the pen tool and I start drawing the shape of an arrow. And I actually like to again get rid of any fill and set the stroke to 0. And this shape will actually have 2 paths in it, one for the tip and one for the actual line. And once I've drawn those shapes, I will dial back in some stroke thickness for this again. In this case, I actually accidentally drew on another layer, which can happen very easily if you don't have anything selected. And what I do now is I select both paths, I press Ctrl X to cut out that path. And now I'm gonna, with nothing selected, just start drawing a new shape. And on that shape, I will now press Ctrl V to paste the arrow that I had previously drawn into. Now with the arrow selected, I will actually go in and add a trim path effect. That's what I use on most of my animations. And I'm going to set it to 0% and 0%. You can see as I'm dialing this in, it's already animating. But what I want to do is start it with nothing. So I have it 0%. And then I'm going to set a key on the timeline to mark my start of the animation. And then I go a little bit further and set it to 0 and 100%. And as you can see, as I'm scrubbing through it, it's already nicely animating into position. Something I like to use is actually bezier tension. So I press F9, which makes it a little bit of an ease in and ease out. And on the trim path effect, you can set the offset to individually, which will now animate the shapes one after another, which is really cool to reveal an object like that. And in this case, I kind of want to change the order of my shapes because I don't like the order in which they're animating by simply putting one on top of the other. Now it's actually the stroke that starts, and then I get the front of the arrow. And that's exactly what I was looking for. And as a next step, I just want to find the place where I want to animate the shape away again. And once I found that spot, I will set a key on the start and end of the trim path effect, and then go to the point where I want to disappear and set it to 100 and 100%. This will nicely animate it out in a different way than it animated in. And now I'm just going to retime this a little bit to find the actual timing that I want. And to give the arrow a little bit of a nicer, less generic feeling, I'm actually going to the taper section of the stroke. I'm going to dial in the start and end length, which will nicely taper at the end and the start of the path. Now I'm going to increase the stroke size a little bit, and I'm going to set the line cap to round cap and the line join to round join. This will overall just give it a little bit more of an organic feeling. I do that a lot, that's personal preference. But with this setting, I'm going to now copy pretty much that behavior a little bit on the main part of the arrow. I'm also going to dial in the taper. And then I'm going to use the wave actually to give it more irregularity. I'm going to make the wavelength fairly big. So it just feels like a little bit there is different pen pressure going on and just doesn't feel so generic again, because I want this to feel a little bit more like hand drawn. Increase the stroke size. And then I'm going to actually dial in the wavelength again a little bit just to position it better along the strokes. And I want that big part to be closer to the actual front part of the arrow. At any point in time, you can still go in and adjust the stroke, which is really nice. So if you feel like now with the new shape, you want to tweak this a little bit, and then I'm going to rename it arrow, and I'm going to duplicate the shape, flip it horizontally, and then reposition it on the other side as another arrow graphic. And once again, I copy my recipe of effects to these arrows, which is really just a gradient ramp, a hue saturation node, and a glow. Now, as mentioned earlier in the tutorial, on the hue saturation node, I animated the channel range, which allows me to subtly change the color from pink into green and just shift it over time a little bit to give it a little bit more variety. And with that in place, you animate your first arrow. And all the other shapes I create in my videos follow pretty much the same philosophy of having simple shapes, strokes with trim paths on it, and then I just animate a few values on it. And that's what gives me my graphics. So let's jump back into the process and add multiple graphics to the video. This is a combination of strokes that I animate in and out, but it's all based on the same principles that I used during the arrow tutorial. But what I like to do is have one type of shape that represents the contact points on the climb. In this case, it's simple circles that are scaling up with another layer that is just a stroke that's scaling up. And as I'm doing so, I already try to retime them a little bit so they start coming in at the right spot. And then I have other shapes that are literally simple strokes and paths, kind of exactly what we did with the climbing holes that we animated. And it's just a path with a trim path effect. And here I just readjust the shape really quickly to match my pose. And all the animation stays the same because it is the same process as kind of what we did with the animation on the holes. And then I position my center of gravity, another line that's just like everything else, a trim path that is just being animated in. That's like my center line. And then I try to find an interesting timing for this. As the black silhouette in the back starts scaling up, I kind of want the other animations to start as well. So I keep adjusting keyframes already in that step. And then this is actually just like everything else. It's super simple, just a path again that is animated with the trim path effect. And then to finish it off, I had some text. In this case, I actually create my own composition where I have text animated and it's just scaling up and scaling down a little bit afterwards and settles. And I do that for every individual letter. So I can animate them one by one coming in. And then because that composition is a little too long, I actually use just a time stretch in order to shorten it up a little bit. That'll also speed up the animation of the text coming in. And then I just use scale and position to bring it into a place where I feel like it fits well. And at that point, now that I have everything animating in, I need to start animating everything out. In order to do that, I already have keys in place. They're pretty much just the opposite of what's happening at the front. So I'd all put them into place real quick so they fade out nicely with the actual black shape. Now at any point in time, I can also just go into the graph editor and scale curves down if I find any of the animations turn out too big, and I do that quite frequently. Here I actually cut the text in half because the end was still too far away, and even with the time stretch there was too much gap in the middle, so I just cut them in half and got rid of anything in the middle. And now with the text and everything animated, this is how it looks like. It's super fast, but like those little details of things being a little offset and coming in after another rather than everything starting at the same time adds a lot of nice detail to the animation. Next, we're gonna check out how we can actually loop our videos seamlessly, and for this I'm going to bring in one of my rotoscopes into the main edit, and it is the same rotoscope as the last shot in my edit. Because I'm using a camera, I want to set this layer also to 3D so that they match nicely, and I'm actually going to copy the position from one clip to the other so that they perfectly sit on top of each other. I copy my first shot and move it at the end of the edit. So I extended the edit a little bit so I can give it some space. I'm going to delete the camera because I actually don't need it because we already have a camera at the end. And now I'm just gonna move it at the end where my last shot ends. I pretty much pretend the edit would continue and it would already loop there. But what I'm doing here now is actually put the rotoscope on top of that first shot, and I want to match the rotoscope with the first shot that I added at the end. And the idea is here that once I have that matched frame, I can just cut the rotoscope there, and then I have it seamlessly playing in the last shot and transitions nicely into the first shot. It's a little complicated, but now you can already see I've got myself actually climbing again while I'm jumping down the wall. The jumping down the wall is my last shot, and me on the wall is actually the rotoscope from the first shot that I just set over. And now because it matches with the first shot, now when I loop it, it plays through nicely, seamlessly. And this is it for this video. Next I'm actually going to show you how I 3D scan the walls and then take that data, put it into Blender and animate a camera on top of it. I hope you guys will have a lot of fun, so let's check it out.